scholarly work on globalisation. So the lecture today is going to be quite like an East Anglia University lecture. One difference is that in East Anglia University lectures we normally would give everyone a copy of the PowerPoint slides. So you will probably have to do a little bit more writing today than you would in an ordinary lecture. But this is, I think, designed to make you pay attention. Anyway, but that's what will happen. Has everybody got the web address? Because that website is actually a superb website with huge amounts of information. So what we're going to look at today is the meaning of globalisation, the successive waves of globalisation since the 19th century. We're going to look briefly, if there's time, at some globalisation controversies. Again, briefly at globalisation research at UEA and at development studies at UEA, which is in process of being changed to international development. Background reading for the lecture. Those two books are very useful. The one by John Ravenhill, edited book, and the one by Raphael Kaplinsky. They're very nice. And probably haven't time. Sorry, do you want to take a little longer to write them down? That's the advantage of giving you handouts, actually. So if you quickly take the titles. And by the way, I put the lecture onto the desktop of the computer, so if anyone after the lecture just wants to download it, they're very welcome. The next slide, I think you won't have time to write them down, but you can download them afterwards. These other 5 references, the first 2 are very new and very interesting. The other ones are more standard. And this one by Joseph Stiglitz is a very famous reference, and Stiglitz was the World Bank's chief economist, and he subsequently won the Nobel Prize in economics. And it's Stiglitz's definition of globalization that we're going to use. And that's a very long definition. Let's read it together. So globalization is the closer integration of the countries and peoples of the world, brought about by the reduction of costs of transport and communication, breaking down of artificial barriers to the flows of goods, services, capital, knowledge, and to some extent people. And that's taken from Stiglitz's book. And almost any major country you go in, France, Germany, Japan, you'll find a translation of his book in a bookshelf. That's a very famous definition. And then some more definitions, quite useful ones by Kaplinsky, whose book I recommended. The first definition is very similar to that of Stiglitz. So this is a view that sees economic globalization as coming about through the reduction of barriers in the world economy. So the barriers to flows of goods, like taxes on imports, tariffs could be reduced. Reductions in barriers to capital movements, reductions in barriers to labour movements. All of those things facilitate globalisation. I don't think they actually cause globalisation, but they facilitate it. And the second definition looks more carefully, I think, at what really causes that, what really drives globalisation. And Kapensky talks of the reasons why individuals, institutions, nations, companies widen their activities across national boundaries. Like, why does Toyota set up a plant in the United States? Why does Toyota set up a plant in Thailand to supply the local market? I mean, what drives that kind of activity? And so the first definition kind of are the things that allow globalization. These are the things that drive globalization. And we can also see globalization as being facilitated by technical advances, you know, things like email, faxes. You know, a company now can get a design, somebody can scan the design in Tokyo and email it to someone anywhere in the world. And it's very, very quick. And by the way, while I talk, do feel absolutely free to interrupt me and ask questions. That's the East Anglia way. It works pretty well, and takes a while to get used to doing it, but if you feel like asking questions, please do. Either things you've not understood and you want me to just say it again, or things that you disagree with. And what happens if you do that, if you just don't understand something, you probably find half the people in the class don't understand it either. So you've done a public service. And if you ask a question to push the lecturer in some direction where you want to go, it makes it more interesting for everybody. So I'll give you a chance to ask questions at the end. I'll give you a chance individually to ask me questions, but anyone who just wants to interject a question, it'll be well. So, what does economic globalization mean in practice? Well, the first thing, the way that economists look at it, is that countries trade more. You know, they sell more abroad, they buy more from abroad, and this has the effect that the share of exports in national output rises. So much more of national output is sold on the international markets. And this increase in what economists will call openness, you know, more trade, in the case of developing countries, that's often come about because developing countries are opening up to the rest of the world. That they're buying more goods from abroad, they're reducing the barriers to trade, they're reducing their taxes on imports, they're trying to develop their exports. And that process whereby developing countries open up to the world economy has very much been pushed by agencies like the World Bank. A second feature is that there's much more foreign direct investment, and it's often to develop exports. Foreign direct investment has a particular meaning. It's where a company from one country sets up a factory in another country. It's different from portfolio investment, where people from one country buy shares or property in another. A third feature of globalization to developing countries is that there's more instability from international capital flows, there's more migration of labour, and a very strong feature of recent years, some developing countries have grown very much more than others. Like China for 30 years has grown at nearly 10% a year in total output. Vietnam has grown by that at that sort of speed since the since the mid-1980s, while some African countries have actually had negative income, negative growth in income. So I'm going to be basing the lecture on looking at three periods of globalization. The first period in the 19th century up to the start of the First World War. The second period from the end of the Second World War to about 1980. And the third period from about 1980. And you can see with these things that we'll talk about later that in the 1970s the previous system was breaking down somewhat. great that some of you are writing some of this down, but the difference between this and a real lecture is that in a real lecture you'd have your own copy of all these PowerPoint slides, which would, I think you can see, will make it all much easier. Okay. Now, this period of globalization is one of the most interesting and very, very instructive. So let's look at its different features. The first feature is this period is one where many, maybe most, present-day developing countries came into the international system. And they came in a very particular way. They came in as exporters of primary commodities like food, like agricultural raw materials, like rubber, minerals like tin or copper. And they came into it generally also in a very particular way that in Africa and Asia, developing countries mainly entered the international system, the world economy, as colonies. I mean, this is the time when many Asian countries were colonized, many African countries were colonized. So Malaysia, on which I wrote my PhD thesis, Malaysia was colonized by the British in about 1874. It quickly was already an exporter of tin. By the end of the 19th century, it was an exporter of rubber. By the early years of the 20th century, it became an exporter of palm oil and then of cocoa. And that was a very typical way. Indonesia entered in a fairly similar way as a Dutch colony. Vietnam entered as a French colony. Thailand wasn't a colony, but it had to sign an unequal treaty with the UK that restricted its freedom of economic policy, and Thailand became an exporter of rice, rubber, tin, and developed in a rather similar way. India also was very much affected by globalization. India was in a way a special case because India was already an important exporter. It exported garments, it exported textiles particularly. And the sadness for India is that when the colonial system developed, so British manufacturers destroyed the Indian textile industry. So for India, that period was somewhat negative. A second aspect of this system is that a number of countries were developed by settlement from Europe, like Canada or New Zealand or Australia, also the Argentine, and they became suppliers of food. So Canada became a major supplier of wheat, Australia became a major supplier of dairy produce. Argentina became a major supplier of meat. Argentina is in here for an interesting reason, because in the 19th century, around about this time, if you'd asked anybody what were the prospects for Argentina, people would have said, oh, just the same as for Canada and Australia. You know, Argentina looked a very, very promising country, but in the event, Canada and Australia became developed countries, and Argentina remains a developing country, for all sorts of reasons. What else did we see? Well, we saw a rise in the amount of world output that was traded. We saw this was all helped by big technical changes, falls in transport costs, steamships replacing sail, railways bringing produce in from the inland to the coast to be exported, the Suez Canal facilitating trade between Europe and Asia. Hi, can you find the seat? Okay, we both understand. So thank you. Okay, that's great. So a rise in investment, although the companies weren't so international as companies are now. like rubber producing companies in Malaysia often just had investments in Malaysia and headquarters in London and nothing else. Another feature of this period, which often people don't think about, is that there are mass migrations of labour. So from southern China, from the two big provinces in the south of Fujian and Guangdong, millions of people migrated to Asia. I mean, Chinese en masse emigrated to Malaysia, where they're now a third of the population. There's substantial Chinese minorities in Thailand, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. The Chinese were very important providers of labour. And also many Indians from southern India, from Tamil Nadu, emigrated to Malaysia, emigrated to Sri Lanka, also emigrated to Africa, where Indians are often an important trading group of people, and often Indians control industrial activity. The rate of growth in this period rose from, doubled, about 0.5% the previous 50 years to 1.3%. That's a very big change, but of course by present day standards 1.3% is pretty slow. I mean, China's been growing 10% a year, 7% a year in per capita terms over the last 30 years. And the international financial arrangements were that every major currency was fixed to gold. So a dollar was worth so many ounces of gold, a pound was worth so many ounces of gold, and by seeing the relative amounts of gold that a currency was worth, we would derive exchange rates. And so gold formed the base of countries' money supplies, and if they had balance of payments deficits, they'd lose their money supply, and that would help to correct the balance of payments. That's a rather simple way of putting it, but to do the whole thing will be a separate lecture. I'll answer any questions on that if anybody's interested, but I'm not going into detail. And then after the end of the First World War until the start of the Second World War, so 1939, the start of the war in Europe, 1941, the start of the Pacific War, globalization is a bad time for globalization. It's a time of recession, of protectionism against imports, so restricting imports, and there was a fall in the amount of trade that was done back to the level of 1870. And then in 1929, the crash in Wall Street in the United States, and by the early 30s, that financial crash had led to mass unemployment in the US, in the UK, Germany, France. Fall in migration, fall in the world rate of growth. One good thing is a general increase in life expectancy. And this set of policies is this set of issues is rather important, and I'd like to, I'm keeping to time, but I'd like to spend a bit of time on these, explain them. One of the features of this time was mass unemployment. And mass unemployment caused by a lack of demand in the world economy and in individual countries. So how can a government try to alleviate mass unemployment? How can it cure unemployment? Well, one way, the Keynesian way, is to increase government spending, and we saw that, for example, in the United States with the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. We saw it, sadly, but effectively in Germany, where they built a road system as well as rearming. But another way of trying to help unemployment is to stop importing goods from abroad, stop buying goods from abroad, cut off imports, and therefore domestic consumers are forced into buying domestic goods, and that raises demand. Which is fine. If your country cuts off imports from other countries, it increases its domestic demand. If Britain does it to the United States, fine for Britain. But if the United States then does the same thing, and France does the same thing, and Germany does the same thing, then all that's happened is none of it has worked, but the amount of trade in the world economy has fallen. And similarly, when countries tried to deal with unemployment by devaluation, it would work for one country. So if Britain could devalue, then it would make its exports cheaper. Americans, in theory, would buy more exports. French would buy more British exports. But then, if the United States suddenly has the same idea, and France has the same idea, and everybody's devaluing, again, it's not effective. So, what this period saw was a set of policies that intended to help one's own country, for example, by reducing imports, at the expense of neighbouring countries. And this is the sense of beggar my neighbour, trying to make my neighbour into a beggar to help myself, to help my own country. And when all countries do that, it just doesn't work. And this is one of the reasons why this period was such a disastrous period. And during the Second World War, when it was clear that the Allied powers were winning, the Americans and the British convened a very, very famous conference in 1944, the so-called Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods is a town in the United States, a small town in New Hampshire, and hosted this famous conference. And at that conference, it was attempted to set up a new international system by agreement. And the new international system focused on three institutions: the World Bank, which was designed to promote the flow of international investment; the International Monetary Fund, which was designed to help with balance of payments deficits; and an organisation which was the forerunner of the present World Trade Organization. A funny name for that first organisation, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which sounds just like a treaty, but actually was an organisation with a staff and headquarters in Geneva. And the aim of GATT and later the WTO was to try to promote free trade in the world economy, to try to reduce those trade barriers that had arisen in the interwar period. So this system also made a big change in international financial arrangements. I've not written it there, but it's worth your knowing. If you already had this written down, you could just write this on your slides. Okay. So just imagine you've got it all written down, add this. The system that it set up was one where the dollar, the US dollar, was fixed to gold. So I think $35 an ounce of gold. And then every other currency was fixed to the US dollar. So pound, $2.80. And so in other words, we had a kind of gold exchange standard. The Americans fixed their currency to gold, and everybody else fixed their currency to the dollar. And how the Americans maintained that convertibility between the dollar and gold was that in principle you could exchange dollars at the US Treasury for gold. That doesn't mean if you're a tourist you could take $1 out of your pocket and get a tiny grain of gold. But it does mean if you were maybe the French central bank, you could say, here are $1 million, please give us the gold. And the Americans were obliged to give the gold. And that was a way of stabilising the system. Okay. And what about this post-war period? Well, this post-war period, starting in 1945, continuing into the 70s, and really ending in about 1980, was maybe the most prosperous period that we've ever seen. I mean, I lived through this. I was a student in the 1960s and a young lecturer in the 1970s. This was a really great time. I mean, this was a time where people typically thought that their children would do better than they did. I mean, it's a huge difference. You know, everybody expected that their children would do better. So, for example, I was the first person in my family ever to go to university, and that was not untypical. When I was at university, there were many students who were the first person from their family ever to go to university. I bought my first house when I was about 27, and my father didn't buy his house until he was in his 60s. Again, that's typical. People buying houses, people being educated, things getting better, and incomes rising. And in this period, we saw not only full employment and growth, we saw trade growing faster than output. So exports in the world economy and imports in the world economy growing faster than output, so that countries became more open, they traded more. And that's an important component. And that was facilitated by many negotiations about cutting trade barriers and lowering tariffs, taxes on trade, lowering quantitative barriers to trade, and that happened. Actually, tariffs were cut more on products of interest to industrial countries, so the biggest increase in trade took place between industrial countries. There was a reduction in inequality between industrial countries, that's to say poorer ones like Spain or Greece or Portugal grew fast and caught up with richer countries like France or Germany, which is sad to see what's happening now with Greece and Spain in so much difficulty. But because in this early period, they did well. And within industrial countries, as a result of social policies, inequality also decreased. But in this development, developing countries as a group were somewhat left behind. And this is a point just to kind of bear in mind, and you'll later see after 1980 how much it changed. In 1980, developing countries as a group were still dependent on primary commodity exports for about 3/4 of their export earnings. In other words, developing countries were still in the colonial pattern. You know, they hadn't moved from being colonies in that sense. So Malaysia, where I did my PhD, it was still exporting tin, it was exporting rubber, it was exporting palm oil, it had added cocoa, but you know, it wasn't, you know, it was only just beginning to export manufactures. And at that time, Malaysia had about half of its national income generated by those commodity exports. So still in the colonial pattern. And most developing countries at this time were still engaging in industrialization in protected home markets. So we say, just as a technical term, import substituting industrialization. That's to say, developing countries were industrializing by keeping imports out, so they would replace the basic goods that they previously imported. Very easy at the beginning. You produce your own textiles, you produce your own garments, you produce your own food, you produce your own shoes. Those things are very easy, and import substitution led to quite rapid development, but then further import substitution actually is quite difficult. And the last few points, this is where the system starts to break down. So it broke down first of all in 1971 with the so-called Nixon Shop. What was that? Well, I said that the international system was set up with the dollar fixed to gold, other countries fixed to the dollar. Now, that generates something quite an interesting situation. It means that if the Americans want to run a balance of payments deficit, in other words, if they want to buy from the rest of the world more than they have to sell, they could rely on other people holding dollars. So countries held dollars all through the world economy, big dollar reserves, and that allowed the United States to consume beyond its means. But that consumption beyond its means had become very controversial. I mean, for example, the Americans financed the Vietnam War not by taxes, but by budget deficits, and they ran up very big balance of payments deficits. So other countries were accumulating dollars. And people started to worry about the size of the US trade and government deficit. And in 1971, a kind of panic took place, led by the French. So the French had been unpopular with the United States for a long time. And what happened is that the French central bank did what I was suggesting earlier. You know, here's $1 million, we want the gold. And other people saw the French, you know, collecting the gold, and other countries started saying, you know, here's our $100 million, please give us the gold. And that doesn't mean, of course, that, you know, the Americans actually physically gave them gold bars. The gold stayed in bank vaults in Fort Knox, but the label on the gold was changed from the United States to France, or the United States to Germany. And by the summer of 1971, the Americans could no longer sustain that. They were running out of gold. So the Americans President Nixon broke the link with gold. And then over the next 3 years, the world economy was in some turmoil. And over this period, 71 to 73, almost all industrial countries adopted floating exchange rates. In other words, they broke the link of their currency to the dollar. They just let their currency be determined in the free market. And that was a very big change. And one impact, one consequence for developing countries is what the International Monetary Fund started to do. Up to 71, the International Monetary Fund had mainly been lending to Western industrial countries. UK had a deficit in 1967, had to devalue. The International Monetary Fund lent it money. Okay? But once industrial countries moved towards floating exchange rates, the IMF was somewhat left without a job. And what did it do? It switched its attention to developing countries. It started to lend to developing countries, and most developing countries had fixed exchange rates with the dollar. And this all leads, and this is particularly significant because at about this time, there were major changes in thinking in development policy. That the reason I've chosen 1980 as the end of this period is because by about 1980 there was a new set of ideas. There was the ideas in Western industrial countries led by Thatcher, led by Reagan, that really developed countries couldn't do much about unemployment, and that they should just let free markets run their course, and that the government should just control inflation. And that had its counterpart in policy towards developing countries, and the new policy in the 1980s towards developing countries, pushed strongly by the IMF, pushed strongly by the World Bank, and because those two institutions were in Washington, it's called the Washington Consensus, a set of policies which said developing countries should let the free market operate. They should open their economies to import competition. They should privatize their state-owned industries. They should stop trying to fix prices. They should stop, supporting agriculture. All sorts of things should be done based on the free market. And that was very influential. And it was influential because many countries in the developing world were having to borrow from the International Monetary Fund, borrow from the World Bank, and that lending to those countries was made conditional on their adopting free market policies. And that particularly was the case in Africa. In Asia, things were rather different. That the most successful countries in Asia, I mean Japan, first of all, but then Japan emulated, copied by Korea, copied by Taiwan, then later copied by China, copied by Vietnam. Those countries, the East Asian countries, adopted completely different policies to the Washington Consensus. They adopted policies of widespread government intervention, of the promotion of key industries, of protecting key industries, of intervening in the market, and surprise, surprise, the East Asian countries which adopted those sorts of policies were very, very successful. I mean, Japan growing at a very rapid rate from the late 1940s up to the bubble bursting in 1990. Korea, similar performance without the bubble. Taiwan, very good performance. Now China, very good performance. Vietnam, very good performance. None of them following the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus was mainly followed in Africa with not very good results. Okay. Anyone want to ask any questions at this stage before we move to the present day? Right. Ready? Globalization from the 1980s. This is a really striking fact. You remember in 1980, most developing countries were dependent on primary commodity exports for their export earnings. By 1998, 80% of developing country exports were manufactured goods. I'm just going to skip ahead. I'll come back to this slide in a second, but let me just skip ahead to the this slide, which is fascinating. Look at some of these figures that I've highlighted. So Malaysia in 1980, its share of manufactures in total exports was under 20%. Yeah? And by 1990, more than half of Malaysia's exports were manufactures. By 1998, 79% of its exports were manufactures. What was happening? Malaysia was becoming particularly an exporter of electronic goods, using free trade zones and foreign investment incentives. You see something even more dramatic in Indonesia. In 1980, Indonesia was exporting almost entirely primary products, of which oil was the most important. When the oil price collapsed in the mid-80s, Indonesia started becoming a manufacturers exporter. By 1998, 2005, almost half of Indonesia's exports were manufacturers. Similar pattern in Thailand. Also, not just Asia, similar pattern in Mexico. But look at the African countries. Nigeria, between 1990 and 2005, virtually no structural change at all. Ghana, negative structural, Ghana hardly any structural change. Some structural change in South Africa as an exception. Some structural change in Mauritius, because Mauritius was an exporter of garments. But much less change in Africa than in the other countries. So what else do we see in the 80s? Well, I've tried to indicate what are key things. One key thing is that international production has become much more integrated. So car companies in Europe with engine plants in one country, gearbox plants in another, motor vehicle assembly in yet another, similar regional production networks in Asia, and a great deal of international trade, helped very much by technical developments, containerization, cheaper air freight, developments in emails, faxes. A second feature, which often you don't hear about, at least in popular discussions, is the importance of something called global value chains. It's a technical word that's worth remembering, because most countries that export labour-intensive manufactures have to get into global value chains. Now, what is that? Well, a global value chain is just a description, at one level, is just a description of the process by which a good is produced. So the garment, country produces cotton, produces thread, produces fabric, produces the garment, and then it finally sells in the shop. But the fascinating thing about garments, but also footwear or travel goods or toys, is where control lies. So typically, a good which costs, say, $50, a garment that costs $50, say a man's shirt, typically that good will cost about $10 to produce, and maybe another $10 to export, to pay any customs duty, to pay the costs of retailing. But the other $3 goes to the retailer. Yeah, so the shop that sells the goods, the garment, gets 60% of the gross value of the output. And the retail end in the garment trade, companies like Gap or Nike, they actually control the whole process of production. Yeah, they don't produce themselves, but they have control. And so a factory in Vietnam or Cambodia may be producing garments for Nike, and they're happy with their $10 per garment, but Nike gets $50. And that's a global value chain. I take the example of garments, but it works for footwear and travel goods and toys, as I said. So that's a very important feature, that countries that want to become labour-intensive manufacturers, exporters, need to get into global value chains, and that by and large Asian countries have been much more successful at doing that than African countries. I mean, garments are increasingly exported by Asia. China, yes, but not just China. Cambodia does it, Vietnam does it, Bangladesh does it. The third feature is financial globalisation, and that China and Japan to some extent have very high savings, and they lend to the United States. So the United States is now a huge borrower, and China, and to some extent Japan, huge lenders. We've also seen gaps develop between developing countries. So in East Asia, in China obviously, but also India, there have been large falls in poverty, but in Africa poverty has often risen. And that this rapid growth that's happened, yes, but some countries are being left out. Okay. And here's just a slide to show how much more open the world economy has become, even since 1990. So in 2000, 20% of world output was exported. 2005, 26%. And some countries like China have become very open. Some countries like Vietnam have become very open. And here, look at Malaysia. What's happening in Malaysia? How can it be that Malaysia in 2005 was exporting 123% of its output? Is it a mistake? Is it a typing mistake? Is it just nonsense? What's happening? Well, I won't, because we're short of time, I won't let you sit there scratching your heads. It's for a particular reason that Malaysia, like Vietnam, like China, is mainly exporting on the basis of imported materials. So Malaysia imports most of its electronic components. So maybe Malaysia is exporting a DVD player for $100, but of that DVD player, maybe $60 or $70 consists of imported components. So these figures are calculated by taking the value of exports, so that will be the DVD player at $100, and dividing it by national income. And because the import content of Malaysian exports is so high, it actually means that its exports are worth more than the value of its output, but that's only the selling price of the exports. So maybe of that $100 DVD player, only $30 was produced in Malaysia. and the rest was just imported. And that's why that figure looks so strange. And that's typical of a country basing its exporting on the processing of imported components and raw materials. I'll do the rest of this, just go through this quite quickly. Globalization is very controversial, and globalization is controversial because it seems to have had two effects. One effect is that it increased the rate of growth, increased incomes, but on the other hand, it's very greatly increased inequality. It's increased inequality between countries, because some countries like China have grown so fast, other countries have grown very slowly. But within countries, and not just developing countries, but within Western countries, there have been huge increases in inequality. So an American skilled worker hasn't had any income increase in real terms for 30 years. And a lot of American workers who had skilled jobs, like in the steel industry or in meat packing, have lost those jobs because they've been competed away by imports. And so a skilled worker has to change to being a shelf stacker in Walmart, and his income may go down by 2/3. So workers in developed countries have done very badly from globalization. And economists usually measure globalization in terms of openness, which is a share of exports in GDP. Now, there's a lot more that could be said here, but I'm trying to keep the time because we have just an hour. So I'll just say that there have been some very famous studies that suggest that globalization has been good for poverty. It's a very famous World Bank study, but it's very controversial. Okay. So Dollar and Cray, the famous article, says that globalization overall increased growth and incomes in the world economy, and that the incomes of the poor increased in proportion as growth happened. Well, that's their result. And I'm going to leave it there, and I'm just going to talk about two more topics. One is research that we've been doing at the University of East Anglia on globalization. We had a very large project, about $1 million US, on globalization in the early 2000s, and we looked at the relation between globalization and poverty, who wins and loses, and what policy can do. We looked at a macro level, which will affect on employment, a meso level, which is global value chains, and a micro level, which is household studies. And I did textiles. I particularly did Vietnam, but I also did South Africa and Hong Kong and China. And we published a number of papers on that. So I'll just skim the rest and introduce you to the School of International Development. So this is now about my university. We have about 40 faculty. We have about 80 PhD students. That number changes a lot because PhD students are always, new ones are coming, existing ones are completing. So in practice it could be as low as 60 in some years and as high as 80 and as high as 100 in other years. That changes a lot. We have about 150 taught postgraduates doing master's degrees, and we have about 250 undergrads who do 3-year degree programs. And we're relatively interdisciplinary. We have 3 main subject focuses: economics, natural resources, like studies of the environment and studies of soil science, and then a combined sociology, anthropology and politics stream. A word about this and this. DevCo is a company for consultancy. And nowadays, when all universities are short of money, the university administration loves DevCo because it makes money. But that wasn't its original purpose. And the original purpose is important. When DEV, the School of International Development, was set up in about 1973, it was decided that it would have more faculty than it had a budget for. So when it was set up, it had about 30 faculty, but it had a budget for only 20. So 1/3 of the faculty had to find their own salaries, had to find outside finance. And that's still the case. The idea is that if you have to spend as a faculty member 1/3 of your time earning outside finance, you do it through doing research projects, you do it through doing consultancies, and the idea originally was that you will be a much better teacher and researcher if you were actually doing practical work. So just to take my case, I've advised the Ministry of Commerce in Pakistan on its export development policy. I've advised the Economic Coordination Minister in Indonesia on export development policy, just to take two cases. And we think that the university likes that because we earn money, but we like it because it gives us experience and it gives students the chance to talk to people who've actually done advisory work. From your point of view of prospective students, that has many, many good aspects, that you have faculty who are more expert in their field and more experienced and are not just teachers from books. It does have one downside, that you may look at the prospectus or the website and think you'd like to work with Distinguished Professor X. Well, great if Distinguished Professor X is there when you're there, but you might suddenly find that Distinguished Professor X is off advising the government of Cambodia for the year that you're there, so you might not see him. And that is a downside for students. But we try to cope with that by always having 2 people in each specialisation. So when I was full-time in DEV, I had a colleague, Rhys Jenkins, and he could teach more or less what I could teach, and I could teach more or less what he could teach. So if he was away, I did his teaching. If I was away, he did my teaching. So it works out reasonably well. Okay, a few more things. Those are our enormous range of master's programmes. There are 15 master's programmes there. I used to direct the MA in Development Economics. The most common MA, the MA in International Development, which used to be called until last year the MA in Development Studies, it's the same thing. That's our most popular programme. It's also the most general. That's to say, you have 2 compulsory courses out of 6, and the rest of the time you can choose what you want to do. So we range from scientific MAs, water security, climate change, environment and development, and practical MAs like MA in agriculture and rural development, gender and development, education, globalisation, social development. So there's a very wide range of choice. The environment and international development, a student who did that programme 3 years ago and got a distinction now works for JICA and was in Tokyo and now is in Cambodia. So our people, our students do get jobs. Wherever I go to a developing country and I visit JICA, there's virtually always a DEV student. So in Pakistan, where I was in 2004, there was a student who'd done a PhD in education and development. There was a student who'd done a PhD in a master's in international development. In Vietnam, there was one of my own students who'd done an MA in development economics who worked for JICA. It's a very typical pattern. In virtually any Japanese agency, aid agency in virtually any country, developing country, you'll find a DEV graduate from Japan. And a lot of alumni. Okay, we're nearly running out of time, so I'll skip this bit about the joint masters programme with Kobe, which is on the website. That's me in the middle signing the agreement with various professors from Kobe. And these are some pictures of East Anglia. These pictures have a life of their own, so I'm going to have to stop them moving forward. This is maybe the nicest picture. The campus is situated just outside the town, a few miles outside the town, on a former golf course and by this lake. This building is the Sainsbury Arts Centre, designed by the British architect Norman Foster and housing a very famous art collection. These things in the front are designed by the same guy who designed the British National Theatre in London. Those are student residences. The buildings at the back are teaching buildings.